The speakers tonight are Francis Flanagan on my left, that's right, and Jim Stanford further over. Francis Flanagan is the Research Director of United Voice, and Dr. Jim Stanford is from the Center for Future Work at the Australian Institute.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and thank you, comrades, for taking your Thursday evening to come out and engage in this important discussion about the future of work. And I'm really thrilled to share the podium with Dr. Francis Flanagan, who's a wonderful asset to our movement, our progressive labor research community, and not just for her union, but for our center. She plays a very active role and other initiatives in town, including the Center for Workplace Futures. Have I got that right? Center for Workplace Futures is another center, not to be confused with the Center for Future Work. And not to be confused with the Future Work Center. And not to be confused with the Center for Future Workplaces. You know what? When we started our center a couple of years ago, this is true. I wanted to call it the Center to Ruthlessly Expose the Iniquities of Capitalism. Okay? That's what I was going to C-R-E-I-C. C-R-E-I-C. But my director at the Australian Institute, Ben Oquist, who's a wonderful person, I hope you all get a chance to meet him. He's a very, very strategic, entrepreneurial, progressive guy. Said, no, Jim, that's not going to work. And he proposed the Center for Future Work, which at first I had to say, that sounds like a namby-pamby name, like what on earth is that about? But he was brilliant, because we get so many cold calls from reporters and government and other things asking to talk about future work, including the one tonight. Although now I know that Joe didn't invite me because it's called the Center for Future Work. You invited me because I had something to do with McMaster University, so. Okay, there we go. Okay, my talk is titled 5 Possibly Surprising Insights on the Future of Work. And I'm going to hopefully pop a few bubbles of some of the hype, I would say, positive or negative, that gets thrown about these days on the subject of work and whether work has a future and what is work going to look like in the future. And I find in the popular discourse, you're either in one extreme or the other. You've either got this incredibly dystopian vision that all work is going to disappear because we're going to be replaced by robots, and the Elon Musks of the world are just going to control it all, and we'll all be starving, and the only way we could possibly support ourselves is through a basic income. And then you've got a ridiculously optimistic view of the same thing, which says, you know, this is wonderful innovation, we're all going to have a higher standard of living and so much leisure time, we don't know what to do with ourselves. And Malcolm Turnbull says there's never been a more exciting time to be an Australian, and so on and so forth. So the reality is neither of those are true, neither of those are remotely true. And I think that both of them, again, from a progressive point of view, even if you're optimistic or pessimistic, and progressives could be either. I know we have a tendency to look on the dour side of things, but we're obviously driven by hope as well, hope and vision of a good future, and so we can look on the optimistic side. But in either case, I think getting sucked into those stereotypes, those extreme stereotypes about what is supposedly new about all this technology, is distracting at best and misleads us down dead alleys as a progressive activist movement at worst. So I am going to put out 5 common themes in the popular discourse about the future of work and argue that they're wrong, and then I'll conclude with what I think makes sense. I do want to refer you to our website, futurework.org.au is the website for the Center for Future Work, and we have a lot of research on that website about the future of work, but we also have research on a range of other subjects. And I want to, in particular, refer anyone who's interested to a more detailed sort of composite piece of research that we did as a submission to a recent Senate Select Inquiry. Senator Murray Watt from Queensland chaired a special Senate committee that looked at the future of work and the future of workers. That was the title of their inquiry. I'd like to They put the workers in the actual title of the inquiry. And we had a submission to that, and I actually thought it was a very interesting inquiry, including to get on paper what all of these nouveau entrepreneur non-employers think about themselves. There's a very telling submission from the Australian CEO of Deliveroo, for example, to this very Senate committee, where he goes on the record as saying, this is the new economy, we're a new business model, and we cannot be constrained by old-fashioned restrictions like the minimum wage. Okay? So, now there's one I never... Yeah. There's one I never ever heard before. An employer saying, I don't want to be tied down by the minimum wage. You know, that's an argument.
Too high for his liking.
Of course it's too high. Anything above zero is too high for his liking. And for how many hundreds of years have capitalists been saying, I don't want to be tied down by any of these restrictions? And he has the gall to come out and say that his argument is new. But it's this aura of the future and not, entrepreneurship and innovation that gives these people more credibility than they deserve. And I think we have to pop that bubble as well. I remember reading one tech pundit saying, Uber is the future, you can't bet against the future. And the idea is, of course, if you're opposed to any of this stuff, you're a Luddite, in essence, trying to stand in the way of inevitable technological change. Well, guess what? I did bet against Uber, and I'm going to win, because Uber has been in business for 10 years and hasn't made a single dollar in profit. A certain number of financial hyper speculators have made money when the share price was going up, but now the share price is going down, and Uber, I suspect, is never going to make dollars profit. So apart from the exploitation and hardship that it imposes on the people who work for Uber, whether the Fair Work Commission considers them employees or not is kind of beside the point. The reality is Uber isn't the future. Uber is a fad, and fads come and go. Okay, my first surprising insight, work cannot disappear. Okay, and I'm old school in this regard. This idea that workers will be replaced by robots, in my judgment, is a fundamental misreading of the nature of production and how value is created in society. And the reality is, there is nothing that creates value, nothing that adds value to the resources that we harvest from nature. Hopefully, we learn how to do that in a sustainable way very quickly. There is nothing that adds value to those things, converting them into usable goods and services, except work. Work, broadly defined to mean productive human labor, our physical labor, of course, our brains, our ability to move things, but more importantly these days, our brains, our capacity to conceptualize, solve problems, and so on. So this idea that we're all going to be replaced by machines is a fundamental misreading of where machines came from, because the reality is they didn't fall from the sky, okay? Machines are simply produced by other workers doing other kinds of work. And there's an obvious distinction in economics between direct labor and indirect labor. Direct labor is where you're producing the product or service that you ultimately want. So our friend at the bartender is doing the final piece of direct labor required to serve the beer to us. Okay? The indirect labor is the work that goes into all of the intermediate stages that were required to get that beer filled and on the table. And that includes the work conceiving, engineering, designing, manufacturing, operating and servicing machinery. So the whole process of economic development over time has been human beings learning how to use more tools in our day-to-day work. Tools is given this kind of glamorous, obfuscating term called capital in our society, but it is ultimately tools, and there's nothing magic about a tool other than the fact that somebody thought of a way to use a tool that makes our work more productive and allows us to do more work, more output, and more interesting work. So the shift in production towards automation, which is not the least bit new, by the way. Humans have been learning how to use tools since we climbed down from the trees in East Africa 100,000 years ago. Now the process by which we can imagine through learning by doing and innovation and incrementally improving those tools obviously is sped up. But there's nothing new about working with tools, and work never gets replaced. In fact, there can be no economy without work. In the broad sense, work is productive human labor. A subset of work is what we call employment, where you're performing that labor for someone else in return for compensation of some kind. A wage, a salary, a commission. You can give it the compensation any name that you want, but you're being told what to do for someone else. Somebody else owns the output that you've produced. Someone else tells you what to do, and at the end of the day, someone else can say you're not needed anymore, goodbye. Most of the work that's performed in the formal economy in our society is employment, but not all. There's other kinds of work, of course, the unpaid work that goes on in our homes and our communities. Employment isn't going to go away either. Work is certainly not going to go away. Employment is not going to go away for the foreseeable future, even if the Fair Work Commission continues with this fiction that an Uber driver is somehow not an employee, which is self-evidently nonsense. The reality is they're still working for someone else, being told what to do, hired and fired in return for some compensation, which in the Uber driver's case is the roughly 30% of the total fare that they're allowed to keep. What is changing, and changing quickly, is the nature of jobs. So a job is the particular way of organizing employment, a particular structure and system for how it takes place and how people are directed and how they're compensated. So work is not going to disappear. For the foreseeable future, employment is not going to disappear, although I'm motivated by the same ultimate hope that we will find a way that we can produce the goods and services we need collectively without organizing it through the wage-labor relationship. What is changing is jobs, generally for the worse, because employers have been given too much power and too much freedom to set the terms for the employment relationship and restructuring the nature of employment. And technology is part of that process. There's no doubt that employers use technology in very creative ways to restructure jobs, but technology is not the cause of that process, and it's very important for us to step back from the sense of technological determinism that the other side tries to invoke all the time, to say this is just how it is, this is the new economy, this is where it's going. There's nothing remotely technological driven. The Uber driver could still be in a traditional job. The thing that's truly unique about the Uber app is simply it's a slightly more convenient way to order a taxi. You know, you can go online and, you know, I know people love the app and they can see how the car approaching, etc., etc., etc. There's nothing remotely in that technology which dictates that this person must now be paid as a so-called independent contractor with no rights, no minimum wage, no superannuation, no leave, okay? They can still do all that. In fact, they could do it better because of the productive possibilities of the app. So we really have to separate the social relationships of the changing employment structures, the social relationships embedded in jobs, if you like, from the technology itself. If in fact technology accelerated and productivity accelerated to the point that we could produce what we needed with very little labor, okay, even then work hasn't disappeared. It's still labor doing the production, but it just means we'll have all kinds of opportunity to, in addition to having a higher material standard of living, have more time off to enjoy that. And of course, we are all in agreement that we have to put shorter working time on the agenda of our movement, but even then work will not disappear. It will always be human labor interacting with what we harvest from nature, hopefully sustainably, that produces the goods and services that we need to survive and thrive. That's the reality. Second surprising insight, labor-saving automation is not actually accelerating, okay? And again, this sounds like I've been living on another planet. How can I possibly say that? There's all kinds of things that machines can do, and particularly in controlled environments and laboratories. But all of this excitement and all this hype and all these amazing videos that you see on YouTube are not actually reflective of how work occurs in the actual economy out there. Has anybody seen that video of the robot that can assemble an IKEA chair? Has anybody seen that one? That one is incredible. I mean, I will say that is incredible. And I will tell you this, that my spouse started looking at me very differently after she saw that video. As in, like, I actually don't need that guy. So these are amazing things, but how often are they actually used in the real world? Some industries and some jobs and occupations are clearly affected, but across the economy as a whole, recorded labor productivity is not accelerating. In fact, productivity growth is probably slowing down. It certainly has slowed down since the GFC, primarily because of the weakness of macroeconomic conditions. There's so much idle surplus labor out there that employers are actually finding new ways to occupy labor in the most menial, unproductive, low-tech ways possible. And if you look at the statistics on what are the highest, fastest growing job occupations in Australia, there's two categories. One of them is care services delivered largely through public services or publicly funded services anyways, which is interesting. The other is low-tech personal and domestic services. So everything from housekeepers to babysitters to dog walkers to people offering yoga classes in the park. This personal services category, very fast growing sector. And it's the most low productivity, low tech type of work you can imagine. And why is that? Because there's a whole group of people who are desperate for work, they'll find anything to do, and there's another group of people who have too much money and can pay those desperate people to do anything they want, including walking their dog. In Australia's case, business investment in capital has plunged by 25% since the peak of the mining boom, which is when Australia decided for some reason it made sense to simultaneously build 8 LNG export plants all at the same time. Now, once those 8 were finished, and we're paying more for gas as a result, capital spending has fallen by 25%. There's no sign of it rebounding. In fact, the aggregate capital-labor ratio in Australia's economy, that's the average amount of tools and technology that the typical worker uses in their job, has been declining now since 2014. So in terms of the actual tools that people are using, it's going backward, not forward. And in all the famous predictions that we hear about 47% of jobs disappearing because of technology, at the current rate of productivity growth, would take about a century to get to the point where we would produce the same amount of output with 47% fewer workers. The third insight, potentially surprising insight, although I think in this room we're ahead of the curve and may not be surprised, the most dramatic impacts of technology on work are not so much in terms of the actual process of production, but in terms of the changes in the relationship between workers and employers. Employers have always used technology as a tool to control the workforce, to organize the workforce, to discipline and supervise the workforce. Nothing new about that. And the ways that technology is being applied today cover many spheres, including management and coordination of work, facilitating hiring and deployment and disemployment of labor, and I think one that's particularly insidious and we don't talk about nearly enough is the use of technology to intensify supervision and discipline in the workplaces. I think this is an issue that would have huge potential for the labor movement to get people on board and get people angry. Technology has made it much cheaper for employers to monitor, discipline, and even fire workers. And you know all the examples. Closed-circuit TV is everywhere. GPS chips will monitor the location in real time of where an employee is at any point in time, down to the boss being able to tell how long you were in the bathroom for. Okay? We can't use technology to figure out whether 7-Eleven franchise owners are paying the minimum wage or not, but we can use technology to tell the boss how long you spent in the crap. Okay, so if you ever need a better example of the non-neutrality of technology, that's it. All kinds of things that monitor the pace of work, and even these different apps that can help employers fire you. One of the most outrageous things about being an Uber driver is you can be fired by a machine that counted how many non-5-star customer ratings you got. And this leads to all kinds of abuse. It leads to the abuse of, first of all, people judging the driver on the basis of the color of their skin, not the quality of their service, and still having that count against them in their file. It leads to all kinds of things, like the drivers having to put up with all kinds of obnoxious, abusive behavior because they don't want to get the star. Or they want to get the stars. Or the drivers paying out of their own pocket for candies and snacks and bottled water. And then this becomes accepted. This becomes expected. Okay, I'm not going to give you 5 stars because where's my free bottle of water that the driver paid for? Or, worse yet now, stories about customers demanding cash from the driver in order to get the 5-star rating that the driver needs. And they have no rights because they're not employees. Normally you would have to go through a whole multi-stage disciplines process before you could discharge someone. In Uber's case, the app can do it.
Counter tips.
Sorry?
Contra tips.
Contra tips. Yes, exactly. That's what it is. It's like the driver bribing the customer. And there's all this nonsense that it's an equal trade because the driver gets to rate the customers as well. And this obviously is about as ridiculous as Paul Samuelson, the great neoclassical economist, saying, what are you talking about, exploitation? It could just as easily work that the workers hire capital instead of capital hiring the workers, as if it's this equal terrain between the driver and the customer. The only difference is it's the driver doing this to put food on the table. Employers are always walking a fine line in the balance between carrots and sticks in their effort to control the hearts and minds of workers and extract the maximum labor effort for the minimum price from workers. And once the sticks become cheap and ubiquitous, there's a lot less reason to use the carrots. And I think that this, apart from being a potential organizing issue for workers, also helps us to understand the stagnation of wages that we're seeing, the supposedly puzzling stagnation of wages, because employers can use machines to discipline people, crack the whip and fire them, as long as there's this pool of desperate workers out there who come in and take their place, instead of eliciting better performance through wages, greater job security, and so on. The fourth point I would make is that there's nothing at all new about the gig jobs of the Ubers and the Deliveroos and the air taskers and so on. The common features, the common qualitative features of what we've called gig work or platform work are basically as old as capitalism. No continuing commitment to work. You have to work on an on-call basis, basically. You're an on-demand type of system. You're paid by the piece. You're not paid by the hour or the day or the week. You're paid for each particular task that you perform. The worker has to provide the equipment and the place where they do the work. The Uber driver has to take responsibility for the car, and so on. And then there's some kind of triangulated relationship between the worker, the end user of the worker's services, and the middle person, the broker in the middle. And all of those things are visible throughout the history of capitalism. The idea of homework, for example, the whole putting out system, which was one of the earliest forms of capitalist employment, involved merchants providing the raw materials, workers, usually women, taking the raw materials home, the textiles, sewing them into clothes or shoes or small housewares, taking them back, getting paid for the work that they did, and then hoping that they get another gig. And all you need in that case is a smartphone, okay? And you would have had the first digital platform business, right? And I know what you could call it. You could call it puttingout.com. Puttingout.com for the putting out system, but maybe that might be misinterpreted in some circles. Puttingout.com. Same goes for piecework, of course. Employers have always tried to get workers to be their own boss through a piecework type of system and paying by the widget instead of by the hour. And the only problem is that once the worker learns how many widgets they can produce, then the boss changes the rate, right? On-call work, that's really old. Excuse me. Sydney itself had the Hungry Mile. That was an example of on-call work where everybody went down, all the longshore people went down to the dock and see who got tapped on the shoulder. And the triangulated relationship, of course, goes back to even pre-industrial days with the agricultural capitalism, the gang masters who would recruit labor and then assign it to jobs and take their cut from the middle. So all of those features are as old as the hills. The only thing that's new is the technology of the coordination of those tasks, and that's where the digital platform comes to bear. But I don't think the technology, again, has caused this. Those practices were there before. They, at various times in history, were more common or less common. Why were they less common? Well, in the post-war expansion, you had different factors that limited the ability of employers to wield these relatively more exploitive practices, including a shortage of labor. If there isn't a constant pool of very hungry, desperate people out there, well, you can't expect that you'll be able to meet your labor needs when you call them up the night before they're wanted, or send them just a text message or a message on their smartphone that they're wanted. If labor's in short supply, then employers have an incentive to try and create a more stable captive workforce, if you like. Also, the stance of regulation and politics was very different. That was a time when workers felt empowered and pushed governments to defend their interests with limits on some of those unfair practices. So those are the things that have really changed more, I think, than technology per se, that have underpinned the re-emergence of those very precarious, insecure forms of work. The last of my things is, my 5 points is, I will argue, it isn't technology, it's the structural and institutional disempowerment of workers that explains why the lives of workers are going downhill in Australia and many other places in the capitalist world. The erosion of the institutions which once supported higher and more equal wages and offered workers more protection both in their jobs and in society, the erosion of those things has been, of course, a priority of neoliberalism, and a combination of the macroeconomic conditions, the changing global political balance, the desperation of workers to accept these jobs even though they're clearly suboptimal and very exploitive, and the clever use of technology as a tool. Technology didn't cause it. We've allowed capital to use technology in this way. This is what's created this just-in-time world of work. And I think that we have to put technology in its place when we're understanding what's happening in the labor force and in the world of work. There's always regulatory, political, social, cultural context for technology, including what technology is developed. It isn't neutral. It doesn't fall from the sky. Technology, which means our knowledge to use tools to work in different ways, is directed by the preferences and priorities of the people who are paying for the innovation effort. And that's why we don't have an app to supervise the payment of the minimum wage, but we do have an app to tell the boss how long he spent in the bathroom. Even beyond that, even with the technology that's there, even if we took it as given, which we shouldn't, how it's applied is obviously going to reflect the priorities and relative power positions of the different groups that can use it. So I think most of us in this room are old enough to remember the movie Terminator, right? When the machines started taking over of their own accord. We are not in the world of Terminator, even with artificial intelligence and so on. It's still human beings controlling the machines. The question is, which human beings are controlling the machines for what purposes? And right now we've given far too much freedom for employers to control the machines for their purposes. So I think it's a mistake to be arguing that technology is the problem. And I think that we could, as a progressive labor movement, put more emphasis on controlling and regulating technology rather than accepting the idea that work is somehow going to disappear because of technology, which it clearly isn't going to do. And I think we could easily develop an agenda of progressive labor demands in the area of technology in the future of work. Strong rights to information and notice and input for workers in terms of technological change in their workplaces. The ability to negotiate how technology is introduced and to negotiate the adjustment process. Curiously, in Australia, which has one of the most repressive industrial relations systems in the whole industrial world, it's often considered out of bounds for the union even to discuss technology, because it's not considered a permitted matter, which is supposed to be directly about the employment relationship. And that assumes that there was a union with any power to negotiate in the first place, which is far-fetched these days. But even if they were, merely having that on the agenda is potentially illegal. I think we could have a heck of a movement around protecting workers against the intrusive and degrading application of automatic monitoring and supervision and discipline technologies. I think people are aghast at the intrusions, and I think it's an issue that young workers would actually get on board about. And we're going to do some work on that this year through our center. We're going to survey people about how many people experience electronic monitoring and surveillance, how many people could be fired by an app, and so on. We're going to do some of that work this year, aren't we, Troy? He said, looking at the guy who's going to do the work. I think we could negotiate commitments from employers around redeployment instead of just throwing people out on the street. Have opportunities for redeployment, training, upgrading. Obviously, we need, at the social level, strong income protections and support for training and adjustment assistance. And we obviously have to fix Australia's totally chaotic and dysfunctional vocational training system. The privatization of vocational education is one of the enormous disasters and should be the proof positive about the flaws of marketization, and it's holding back the economy. It clearly is holding back the economy. We need a full employment commitment at the macroeconomic level. It's much easier to move people from one job to another if their job was affected by technology when you're operating close to the frontier rather than at present where we have probably a 15% true unemployment rate. Finally, there is one type of work, and I'm sure Francis is going to talk about this, that is not going away with technology, and that is human caring labor. And it has become, as I mentioned, one of the biggest sources of new work in our society, which is the hands-on care that we give to our young people, our elders, students, people in medical care and elsewhere. And instead of somehow bemoaning that as growing government or whatever, a waste, a drain, we should see it as an economic opportunity, including, of course, the benefit of the care itself. But more important, or equally important, I would say, is the jobs in high-quality care work that could help to fill the void. So on the whole, I think work is not going to go away, and in a way, there's almost nothing new about what we're confronting today. I think we're confronting the same sorts of problems that workers under capitalism have been confronting for 200 years. The machines are shinier, they can assemble IKEA furniture, but they're still being wielded by a very small section of society which has been given the power to wield that technology for their own profits instead of to use the potential of technology to uplift the human condition. And I think looking how to seize control over technology and use it for our benefit should be the core of what we're fighting for, rather than fearing that somehow work is going to disappear, because it won't.
Excellent.
Thank you.